The small CAF on the corner of the bustling street was known for its charm quaint tables, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and a menu of artisan pastries that locals raved about. Despite its popularity, one thing about the CAF was often whispered about but never openly addressed: the waiter. A young man with sharp features and a sharper tongue, he had a knack for leaving customers feeling smaller than they had when they walked in. His dismissive tone and haughty attitude were often tolerated because of the CAF's otherwise stellar reputation. But today, his arrogance was about to meet its match. She walked in quietly, her entrance almost unnoticeable among the lunchtime rush. Her appearance was understated: a simple coat, a scarf wrapped neatly around her neck, and a pair of glasses that seemed to shield her from prying eyes. She carried herself with a calm dignity, though something about her demeanor hinted at a quiet strength that was hard to ignore. The waiter, standing by the counter with a bored expression, glanced at her as she entered. His eyes flicked up and down, assessing her in a split second. To him, she was just another ordinary customer, likely here for a coffee and a quick bite. He let out an audible sigh as she approached a table near the window. Without so much as a greeting, he strolled over, menu in hand, and dropped it onto the table with a clatter. "What can I get you?" he asked, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. She looked up at him, unfazed by his curt manner. "I'd like a cappuccino, please," she said softly. Her voice was steady, polite, almost too polite, considering the lack of courtesy she'd been shown. The waiter rolled his eyes. "Anything else? Or are we keeping it simple today?" he added with a smirk, clearly entertained by his own wit. A few heads turned at his remark, but no one said anything. The woman, however, didn't react the way most customers did. There was no flustered apology, no uncomfortable laugh. Instead, she smiled a small, knowing smile that seemed to catch him off guard. "That'll be all for now," she replied, her tone unchanging. As he walked away, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "Unbelievable. Some people act like they're royalty just because they want their coffee perfect." The comment was unnecessary, cruel even, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she opened a small notebook she'd been carrying and began to jot something down. Her calm composure contrasted sharply with the simmering tension in the room. The CAF's usual hum of chatter seemed to dip, as though everyone was waiting to see what might happen next. When the cappuccino arrived, the waiter placed it on the table with a clink that seemed intentionally forceful. A tiny splash of foam landed on the saucer, but he didn't bother to clean it up. "There you go," he said, barely glancing at her before turning on his heel. "Thank you," she said, her voice as even and calm as before. She picked up her cup and took a small sip, her expression unreadable. Minutes passed, and the CAF gradually returned to its usual rhythm. The woman sat quietly, occasionally writing in her notebook, while the waiter returned to his routine of taking orders and making snide remarks to anyone who didn't meet his unreasonably high standards. Yet, every so often, his eyes darted back to her table, as if he couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. Then, something happened that changed the atmosphere entirely. A man in a crisp suit entered the CAF, his presence commanding immediate attention. He scanned the room briefly before making his way straight to the woman's table. "Excuse me," he said, his tone respectful. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe we have an appointment scheduled." The waiter, who had been watching from a distance, frowned. "Appointment?" This didn't make sense. People who came here for meetings usually dressed the part, carried laptops or portfolios. But this woman? She was far too plain, too unassuming. There had to be some mistake. The woman closed her notebook and smiled warmly at the man. "Of course," she said. "Thank you for coming." They began to talk in hushed tones, their conversation too low for anyone else to hear. The waiter tried to focus on his other customers, but his curiosity got the better of him. He kept glancing over, trying to piece together what was happening. And then, the man in the suit did something that made the waiter's stomach drop. He handed the woman a card, a sleek, embossed card that looked unmistakably official. She accepted it with a nod, tucking it carefully into her notebook. The waiter's mind raced. Who was she? Why was someone like her meeting with a man like that? His earlier remarks suddenly felt heavier, the memory of them replaying in his mind with a growing sense of unease. When the man left, the woman remained at her table, finishing her coffee in silence. As she stood to leave, she approached the counter to pay. The waiter, now visibly uneasy, avoided her gaze as he processed her payment. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, her tone polite but laced with an edge that wasn't there before. She slipped her receipt into her pocket and walked toward the door. But just as she reached it, she paused. Turning back, she met the waiter's eyes for the first time that afternoon. Her gaze was steady, piercing even, and it made him feel as though she could see right through him. "I hope you'll treat the next person who walks in with a bit more kindness," she said softly. Her words weren't angry or accusatory. They were simply true. And with that, she was gone. The CAF buzzed with whispers the moment the door closed behind her. Customers speculated about who she might be, what the card meant, and why a man in a suit had treated her with such deference. The waiter, meanwhile, stood frozen behind the counter, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. It wasn't until much later, when the CAF was closing and he was cleaning up, that he noticed something on the table where she'd been sitting. Tucked beneath the salt shaker was a small envelope. With trembling hands, he opened it, revealing a handwritten note inside. The words on the note made his heart stop. Who was she? And why did her message leave him questioning everything he thought he knew? His fingers tightened around the small note, the paper feeling delicate yet impossibly heavy in his hands. He swallowed hard, glancing around as if someone might be watching, but the CAF was nearly empty now. The last few customers had left, and his coworkers were too busy wiping down tables and stacking chairs to notice his hesitation. Taking a slow breath, he unfolded the note, his pulse quickening as his eyes scanned the elegant handwriting. You never know who you're speaking to. Words have weight. That was it. No name, no explanation, just that single sentence, but it struck him deeper than he expected. His throat went dry, and a strange unease settled in his chest. He read it again, as if the meaning might change, but it didn't. The words remained as firm and unshakable as the feeling creeping over him. He didn't understand why, but a knot of regret twisted in his stomach. He had brushed her off, treated her like she didn't matter, but now he wasn't so sure. Something about her had been different, and he had ignored it. "Hey," one of his coworkers called out, breaking him from his thoughts. "You done over there? We need to lock up." He shoved the note into his pocket, nodding quickly. "Yeah. Just finishing up." The walk home felt longer than usual. The city lights flickered overhead, cars rumbled past, and voices echoed from distant alleyways, but his mind wasn't on any of it. He kept replaying the scene at the CAF, the way she had carried herself, the way the suited man had treated her with such respect. He had been too blind to see it before, but now it was obvious she was someone important. But who? His arrogance had led him to dismiss her immediately. He had assumed she was just another forgettable customer, but something told him he had made a huge mistake. The realization made him feel sick. By the time he reached his apartment, his curiosity had turned into something more, an obsession. He kicked off his shoes, tossed his jacket onto the couch, and pulled out the note again. The words stared back at him, as if daring him to figure it out. The next morning, he arrived at work feeling restless. The CAF was already filling with customers, the smell of coffee thick in the air, but he could barely focus. He kept glancing at the door, half expecting her to walk in again, though he knew it was unlikely. "Are you okay?" his coworker asked, raising an eyebrow. "You look weird." "I'm fine," he muttered. But he wasn't. Hours passed, the usual crowd came and went, but she never showed. His frustration grew. He didn't know why he cared so much, but the need to understand who she was wouldn't leave him alone. And then, just when he was about to give up, something unexpected happened. A man walked in, not the same suited man from yesterday, but someone else. He was older, with graying hair and a presence that immediately commanded respect. He wore a dark coat, the kind that looked expensive, and when he reached the counter, he didn't glance at the menu. He simply studied the waiter with an unreadable expression. "You were working yesterday, weren't you?" the man asked, his voice steady. The waiter tensed. "Yeah." "Why?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it carefully on the counter. The waiter's eyes dropped to it, his breath catching slightly when he saw the embossed lettering. It was the same kind of card the suited man had given the woman yesterday. "I believe you had an encounter with someone important," the man continued. "And I think you should understand exactly who she is." The CAF suddenly felt too quiet, as if the noise around them had faded into the background. The waiter's fingers hovered over the card before he finally picked it up. He turned it over, reading the name printed in clean, sharp letters. And then his stomach dropped. He knew this name. Everyone did. She wasn't just someone important. She was someone who could change lives with a single decision. Someone who held power in ways most people could only imagine. His heart pounded. He had insulted her. Dismissed her. Treated her as if she were nothing. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he looked up at the man, words failing him. "She doesn't hold grudges," the man said after a moment, as if sensing his panic. "But she doesn't forget either." The words sent a chill down his spine. Without another word, the man turned and walked out, leaving the waiter standing there, gripping the card like it might disappear. His mind spun, panic creeping in. What had he done? He had spent so long looking down on others, never once thinking that he might be the one being judged. And now, it seemed, he had been. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. And for the first time ever he regretted it. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. Orders were placed, drinks were served, customers came and went, but he barely registered any of it. His mind kept circling back to that name on the business card, the weight of it pressing down on him like an invisible force. He had seen that name in news articles, heard it spoken in interviews, even glimpsed it in headlines on financial reports. She wasn't just powerful, she was the kind of person whose decisions could shape industries, whose influence reached beyond what most people could comprehend. And he had mocked her. Treated her like she was nothing. His stomach twisted at the thought. He had never considered himself a bad person, just someone who didn't waste time on pleasantries. But now, standing here with the memory of his own arrogance playing over and over in his head, he realized how wrong he had been. He kept glancing at the CAF doors, half hoping she would walk in again so he could apologize, though he had no idea what he would even say. But she didn't return. Hours passed, and the weight of regret only grew heavier. By the time the CAF closed, he felt drained. He stuffed the business card into his pocket, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the cold night air. The streets were quieter now, the city lights casting long shadows as he walked home. But something felt different. It was as if the world itself had shifted slightly, like he was seeing things with new eyes. He thought about the way he had treated people in the past. The customers he had brushed off, the subtle jabs he had thrown at those he deemed unimportant. How many of them had walked away feeling the same way she had? How many had been affected by words he had carelessly tossed around? As he reached his apartment, he pulled out the small note she had left behind. The words seemed even heavier now. You never know who you're speaking to. Words have weight. He sank onto his couch, running a hand through his hair. The worst part was knowing he couldn't take it back. The moment had passed. She had walked out of the CAF, and for all he knew, he would never see her again. But then, his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, assuming it was one of his coworkers, but something made him check. When he saw the unknown number, his breath caught. Hesitating for only a moment, he opened the message. Meet me tomorrow. Same CAF. Noon. His heart pounded. No name, no details, but he didn't need them. He knew exactly who it was. He barely slept that night. His mind raced with possibilities. Was she going to confront him? Was she angry? Or worse, was she here to make an example of him? The thought made his chest tighten. He had seen how powerful people operated. They didn't yell or make a scene. They made quiet moves that changed everything without a single warning. By the time morning came, his nerves were frayed. He forced himself to eat something, though he barely tasted it. Every part of him screamed to back out, to pretend the message had never come, but he knew that wasn't an option. When he arrived at the CAF just before noon, his palms were sweating. The place was busy, but not as crowded as the day before. He scanned the room, searching for her, and there she was sitting at the same table by the window, her notebook in front of her, a cup of coffee resting beside it. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. A quiet intensity. A sharpness that told him she was not someone to be underestimated. He hesitated for a split second before sitting across from her. She didn't say anything right away, just watched him with that unreadable expression. Finally, she spoke. I see you got my message. He swallowed hard. Yeah. She took a slow sip of her coffee, then set the cup down carefully. I wanted to give you a chance, she said, her voice calm but firm. To explain yourself? The words hit him harder than he expected. Explain himself? He had no excuse. He knew it. She knew it. Still, he tried. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I don't have a good reason. I was rude. Dismissive. I didn't know who you were, but that shouldn't have mattered. She nodded slowly, as if considering his words. And why do you think it did? He frowned. What do you mean? She tilted her head slightly. You just admitted you wouldn't have treated me that way if you had known who I was. But that's the problem, isn't it? He felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. She was right. If she had walked in wearing something expensive, if she had been someone he had recognized from the start, he would have been falling over himself to be polite. But because she had looked ordinary, he had dismissed her. Shame burned in his chest. I guess. I don't know. I never really thought about it before. His voice was quieter now. I never expected someone like you to walk into a place like this. She let out a small, almost amused breath. That's the problem with expectations. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the CAF buzzed around them, but it felt like they were in their own separate space. Finally, she leaned forward slightly. I'm not here to humiliate you, she said. But I do believe in teaching lessons where they're needed. His throat tightened. He had no idea what that meant, but he wasn't sure he was ready to find out. She pulled something from her notebook and slid it across the table. A folded piece of paper. His hands felt heavy as he reached for it. As he unfolded it, he braced himself, expecting some kind of formal letter, a warning, maybe even something legal. But when he saw what was written, his heart nearly stopped. The words on the page made his breath hitch. His hands trembled slightly as he looked up at her, eyes wide. And then, for the first time since he had met her, he understood exactly what was about to happen. And it changed everything. His hands tightened around the paper, his breath uneven as he read the words again, trying to make sense of them. It wasn't what he had expected. Not a warning. Not an official letter. But something far worse. A list, names, locations, connections. Some were familiar, Others weren't, but one thing was clear. This wasn't random. He looked up at her, his chest tightening. What is this? She sipped her coffee, unbothered by his growing panic. A reality check. His throat felt dry. I don't understand. You will. She leaned back, watching him closely. You assume people like me only exist in boardrooms, on magazine covers, in places far removed from your world. But influence isn't just about money or reputation. It's about knowing things before others do. She gestured to the paper in his hands. That's what real power looks like. A cold chill ran down his spine. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the fact that she had this information or the fact that she had handed it to him so easily. He glanced down at the list again, his mind racing. Some of the names were tied to businesses he recognized. A few were customers who had come through the CAF. But others had no obvious connection, at least not to him. He swallowed hard. Why are you showing me this? Her gaze didn't waver. Because you need to understand that words have consequences. Actions do too. You think working in a CAF, serving drinks, treating people however you like is just another day for you. But the world is smaller than you realize. Every interaction, every decision, every careless insult, it ripples outward. You never know when someone will remember. His fingers tightened on the paper. Are you trying to scare me? No, she said simply. I'm trying to wake you up. His pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to believe this was some elaborate mind game, some strange way of making a point. But the details on that list were too precise, too real. His voice was unsteady. What do you expect me to do with this? She studied him for a long moment, then reached for her notebook again, flipping a page as if this were nothing more than a casual conversation. That's up to you. The words sent a shiver down his spine. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. Not because she had threatened him, she hadn't. Not because she had told him what to do, she hadn't done that either. But because she had given him a glimpse into something far bigger than himself, and now he couldn't look away. The air between them felt heavier. He wanted to press for answers, to ask why she had even bothered with him in the first place, but deep down, he already knew. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing him. It was about making sure he never forgot. He let out a slow breath. I don't think I can go back to normal after this. She smiled slightly. That's the point. The tension sat between them like an unspoken challenge. He had walked into this meeting expecting to apologize, maybe face some consequences for how he had treated her. He hadn't expected to be handed something that felt dangerously close to a choice, a door he hadn't known existed suddenly open in front of him. He looked around the CAF, at the people going about their day as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. His voice was quieter now. Why me? She tapped a finger against the table, considering. Because sometimes people need to see the world for what it really is. She nodded toward the paper in his hand. And sometimes they need a push. A strange mix of fear and curiosity twisted in his gut. He had spent years thinking he had people figured out, thinking he knew who mattered and who didn't. But she had walked in, turned his world upside down, and now he wasn't sure of anything anymore. She glanced at her watch, then stood. You'll figure it out. His heart pounded as she picked up her notebook and turned to leave. He wanted to stop her, to ask what she meant, but the words caught in his throat. She walked to the door, paused, then looked back one last time. Be careful what you ignore. One day, it might be the most important thing you ever missed. And then she was gone. The CAF felt too loud, the sounds of clinking glasses and quiet conversation crashing over him like waves. He looked down at the paper again, his hands still trembling. He had spent so long assuming power was something other people had. Something he would never have to think about. Now he wasn't so sure. And worse, he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. He sat there for what felt like forever, staring at the paper in his hands. His mind raced through every possibility, every connection, every unspoken warning hidden between her words. This wasn't just about him being rude to the wrong person, this was something deeper. He had been pulled into something he didn't understand, something much bigger than a simple mistake. And now, he couldn't just walk away from it. The names on the list burned into his mind. He recognized more of them now, piecing together small details from conversations he had ignored or brushed off. Some of these people were regulars at the CAF. Others were tied to businesses in the city. There was a pattern here, but he couldn't quite see it yet. And that was what terrified him the most. He shoved the paper into his pocket and stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. The CAF noise buzzed around him, but it felt distant, muffled. His feet carried him outside before he even knew where he was going. The cold air hit him, snapping him back to reality. He needed to find her. He needed answers. His eyes scanned the street, but she was gone. Of course, she was gone. She had left him with this puzzle, and now it was up to him to figure out what to do with it. His hands clenched into fists. He wasn't the kind of person who got caught up in things like this. He had always kept his head down, focused on himself, never thinking too much about the people who passed through his life. But now he was realizing how little he had actually been paying attention. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He didn't even know what he was searching for. A name? A clue? Something to tell him what he had just stepped into. But then, before he could do anything, his phone buzzed. A message. No name. Just 3 words. Look behind you. His blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned. Across the street, parked by the curb, was a black car. The windows were tinted, but he could feel the weight of someone watching him. His heart pounded. This wasn't a coincidence. Before he could think, the car door opened. A man stepped out. Dressed in a dark suit, sunglasses even though the sun had started to set. He didn't look threatening, but there was something about the way he moved, calm, precise, deliberate. The man nodded toward him. Get in. His pulse thundered in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow breath and crossed the street. He slid into the car, the door shutting behind him with a quiet finality. Inside, the air was cool, the city noise fading as the car pulled away from the curb. He forced himself to stay calm. Who are you? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, something familiar. A business card. Her business card. His breath caught. She told us you'd figure it out, the man said finally. He frowned. Figure what out? The man glanced at him, the hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. That you're not just some CAF worker anymore. His stomach twisted. He didn't like the way that sounded. I don't understand, he said slowly. The man leaned back, studying him. You will. The car turned a corner, and in the distance, the skyline of the city stretched out before him. Everything looked the same. But nothing felt the same anymore. And for the first time, he realized this wasn't just about what he had done. It was about what he was about to do next. The car sped through the city, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. The man remained silent, his expression unreadable. His eyes flickered toward him occasionally, but other than that, he gave no indication of why they were headed toward the outskirts of town. The farther they went, the more tense the air seemed to get. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening now, he wasn't in control anymore. The car finally slowed and turned down a narrow, unmarked road. It led them to a sleek, modern building that looked more like a private estate than anything else. His heart raced as the car came to a stop, and the man opened the door for him without a word. He stepped out, his mind swirling with questions he had no answers to. They weren't just outside the city now, they were in a place that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. He glanced around, taking in the high walls and the thick gates. The building before him was elegant, its design minimalist but imposing. There were no signs, no indication of what this place was or who ran it. "This way," the man said, gesturing toward the door. His legs felt like lead, but he followed anyway, unsure of what else to do. They walked inside, passing through a grand hallway lined with art and expensive furniture. The space was meticulously designed, each detail perfect, like a model home built to impress. He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, as if he had wandered into a world that was far beyond anything he had ever known. At the end of the hall, the man stopped at a door and knocked lightly. Without waiting for a response, he opened it and gestured for him to go in. He stepped inside. And there she was, sitting behind a large desk, looking every bit as composed and powerful as he had imagined. Her eyes met his, cool and calculating, but there was no anger, no judgment, just an intensity that seemed to pierce through him. "Sit down," she said, her voice steady but commanding. He obeyed, sinking into the chair across from her. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city outside. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him, the tension in the room thick and heavy. She had brought him here for a reason. She had given him the business card, the list, the cryptic messages, and now, he was here. Finally, she broke the silence. "I know you're wondering why you're here." He nodded, his throat tight. "I don't understand any of this." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't about your apology anymore. It's about your future. Your choices. You can keep living the life you've been living, where you treat people however you want, ignoring the consequences. Or you can change. Make something of yourself. Take control of the power you've been blind to." His mind raced. "Power? What power?" She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a look that suggested she knew something he didn't, and that knowledge gave her the upper hand. The power that comes from seeing the connections between things, from understanding the ripple effect of every action. The power to make decisions that matter. He felt a knot form in his stomach. "And what exactly am I supposed to do with that?" "You already have the answer," she said, her voice low. "You know the names on that list. You know what's at stake. This is your chance to step up and be someone who can change things. Not just for yourself, but for everyone around you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He had no idea what she was talking about. He wasn't some mastermind. He was just a guy who served coffee, who had been rude to the wrong person. But the more she spoke, the more he felt the weight of her words settle deep inside him. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She chuckled softly, but it wasn't mocking. "You are. You just don't realize it yet. The people you dismiss, they're part of something bigger. And so are you." His thoughts raced, piecing things together. He had always assumed that people like her, powerful, influential, had no real connection to his life. But now he was starting to see things differently. The connections, the consequences, the way everything fit together like pieces of a puzzle. She stood up, walking around the desk and stopping in front of him. "This isn't just about power. It's about choices. The choices you make every day, the way you treat people. You can choose to make a difference, or you can choose to stay where you are.